Welcome to the Westminster News Podcast, your alternative to the mainstream media.
Now, as well as a podcast, we do have some fantastic articles over at westminster.com, and one that has really struck a chord over the weekend was with a former Brexit Party MEP colleague of mine, Ben Habib. Ben, how are you?
Hi, morning, Michael. How are you?
Good, I'm good. I just wanted to speak to you about this article you did over the weekend because it's really struck a chord with people. Now, you can sort of go over it yourself, but it's entitled I Am Not BAME, and you're sort of hitting back at this identity politics labelling. First of all, can you just give an oversight as to what your issue is with this sort of labelling in society now?
Yeah, well, it's a label that was relatively new to me. I hadn't heard it till about a year ago, and when I first heard it, it kind of grated with me, but I didn't give it much thought. And obviously, since then, we've had BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the use of terms like BAME have, in my own mind, been much more analyzed, if you like. So I'm not putting this particularly well, but I've come to really focus on what these terms mean and how they're used. It had grated with me initially, but I hadn't really focused on it. And I realized, actually, it's a brilliantly clever way for people like Black Lives Matter, who've got a nefarious aim to undermine, not just the not just the United Kingdom, but also any kind of capitalist Western democratic system. If they want to undermine that, the best way to do it is to pitch groups of people against other groups of people. And when you classify people as BAME, effectively what you're saying is everyone other than white people are BAME. And you're creating a massive division in Western countries, particularly, which are obviously majority white, between their ethnic minorities and the predominant indigenous population. And it struck me that actually this is precisely how the term is being used. And so I felt compelled to call it out. It had grated initially, but I hadn't really focused on how nefarious its use could be until the Black Lives Matter movement kicked off.
Could you just tell people a bit about your background? Because you write in the piece, really interesting. You were born to a Pakistani father, a white British mother in Karachi in the 1960s. You say you had an early childhood as a time of largely carefree fun and learning. You said, unknown to me at the time, I attended a school with children from different ethnicities, religious beliefs, and socio-economic classes. We did not view our peer group through any prejudice prism. Actually pretty similar to my background, Ben, I have to say. A lot of my friends when I was growing up from back home, we're from all sorts of different ethnic backgrounds, etc. And I've always felt that as soon as I left school, the sort of politically correct elements of society were constantly trying to undermine differences between us and underline differences, I should say, between us, saying that things are that race is something you should really be obsessed about, when I've always rejected that. And as I grew up, I didn't see that at all. And it sounds like you had a similar experience.
Absolutely, I had a similar experience. And Black Lives Matter movements like that might regard as all Pakistanis as one homogeneous sort of race, but Pakistanis are not a homogeneous race. In Pakistan, you've got Parsis, you've got Sunnis, you've got Shias, you've got Jews, you've got Christians. And I went to school with all of that mix of backgrounds and religions and so on. And I wasn't aware of the people in my class who were Jews, or the people in my class who were from the Shia faith, or from the Parsis, who are from Iran originally. I was totally unaware of them, and we just rubbed along. We enjoyed our sports, we enjoyed our classes, or didn't enjoy them, depending on how we were doing, but we just had a perfectly normal childhood. And it was the same after I left Pakistan. Pakistan had some troubles in the 1970s, and my parents decided to send me to boarding school at Rugby, which, by the way, even though it was a privileged education, was a barbaric institution in terms of its infrastructure back in the late 70s and 80s. But even at Rugby, the only thing that matters was success in the classroom and on the sports field. No one gave two hoots about your background. And, that's what we focused on.
Well, in many ways, you're sort of a role model because you say you arrived the lowest in my year, totally unfamiliar with the new syllabus. You say by the time I left, I'd achieved straight A's, been promoted to head boy, and earned a place at Robinson College, Cambridge University. I was able to achieve this in part because no one told me I couldn't. Do you think that's an element of society that we're now missing, Ben, in terms of telling kids from different backgrounds that actually they can go on and achieve things?
Yeah, well, I think it's very dangerous to tell a child you're BAME and therefore all non-BAME people around you are prejudiced against you and you need help. I mean, it's enough to destroy a child's self-confidence, first of all. And then, the other aspect to it, which is of a lesser significance, is if that child does go on to succeed in life, he'll always wonder whether the success was as a result of special treatment that he got, whether he'd actually achieved it on his own. But, the reason I mentioned that in the article is because when I went to rugby, I did have a Pakistani accent. People could have focused in on me and ostracized me, but I wasn't. I was taken into the community. Even though I was entirely unfamiliar with the syllabus, I was given all the attention I needed, or any other student might have also needed, in order to understand it and get to grips with it. And in so doing, I was able to rise up. And I went from being in the bottom class to being in the top class. And I don't say that because it's a moment of immodesty. I say it simply to exemplify that in a in a colorblind, ethnicity blind environment, you are much more likely to strive and succeed when the emphasis is on success rather than on where you're from. And that's what it was at rugby. It was all about how are you going to get on in life? Are you going to do well in the classroom? How are you going to do well in the classroom? What are the essential elements of progressing in the classroom? And all the same questions about the sports field. It was a very balanced curriculum. I was very lucky like that. Rugby was superb. It had equal emphasis on sport and academia.
Yeah, I mean, you describe again. You say in the article it's patronising, insulting, and the laziest way to define people. It is racist. The label is the language of exclusion and division. Ben, why do you think that some have fallen into this trap now of using and throwing around this type of language? I mean, every time you sort of turn on the TV now, they seem to be throwing around terms like this. Why has our society gone this way?
Well, I think it's been hijacked by forces that wish to undermine us, including organizations like Black Lives Matter. But because they invoke, if you give it very cursory thought, which the vast majority of people will do, if you give it very cursory thought, at first glance, it looks like, well, actually, they're just trying to put right, what happened 400 years ago and try and equate the playing field in, a bit in their favor. But actually, it's not that. What they're trying to do is to aggregate together all ethnicities into one bunch so that they can actually cause a division between themselves and the rest of the country. And in doing that, they can actually advance their nefarious aims. And in the case of Black Lives Matter, that is to undermine capitalism, defund the police, and generally sow anarchy, as far as I can see. And I think it's very lazy thinking on the part of our media and our educational establishments, who've all fallen for this kind of woke, soft messaging. They've all fallen for it without really thinking what its effect is. And it's incredibly lazy and deeply dangerous, I think, for the progression of our society.
I mean, I don't know what you think of this. I mean, one of the most ridiculous terms I see banded about quite often, another one, is when you hear on speaking on behalf of the black community or the Asian community. I mean, you wouldn't for a second ever see someone on TV saying the white community. And yet it's another example where people seem to put themselves forward as to or are presented as speaking on behalf of other people of ethnicities purely because they look like them or they're from similar backgrounds to them. I mean, to me, that has never made sense. And it's another example. I don't see why that's even a thing.
No, I mean, it's absolutely absurd, BAME is the most absurd of the lot because, of course, it takes in all ethnicities and, different ethnic backgrounds have different ways of, different cultures, different heritages, different behavioral systems, so it's just absurd. And you simply can't lump people together like that. It just doesn't make any sense.
We're going to move off this in a minute, but I just want to give you the opportunity. I mean, what would you say to those, and there are some in the country that say Britain is an institutionally racist country, that if you're not white, you have less opportunities, and that there's massive prejudice and racism in Britain. What's your response to that?
I think it's utter bollocks. to coin to coin a professional sort of turn of phrase. No, I mean, I think it's just horrendous that anyone. It's just not my experience. And I've lived in the country since 1979, as you now know from my article, and I have not experienced any form of institutional racism. Sure, there have been people who've used my race, to call me out on the street or whatever, but that's not the United Kingdom. That's not the institutions of the United Kingdom or our education establishment. I'd say our education establishment is left-leaning, progressive in its political sort of ideology. It supports, perhaps more than it should, it supports people of color. I hate that expression too, by the way. But it supports BAME people I think, to the material detriment, by the way, of white disadvantaged boys and girls who have real social issues, who come from deprived backgrounds, and who are therefore overlooked. There was a benefactor a year ago, I can't remember exactly when. There was a benefactor who wanted to give a scholarship, endow a scholarship for Winchester College for white underprivileged boys so that they could make it to Winchester. And Winchester refused to take the scholarship. Now, to take his money. And you can imagine that if he'd sought to endow scholarships similarly for black boys, you can just see they would have accepted it without thinking. And but they turned it down because he wanted to go to white disadvantaged boys. And why shouldn't he? Why shouldn't why shouldn't someone be able to actually champion the rights of all socially disadvantaged people? Not whether they're just black or brown or Chinese or whatever. It just doesn't make any sense.
How do we get away from this, Ben? How do we get away from this sort of labeling and discourse?
We just got to stop. We've got to stop labeling people, and we've got to change the values in our society, and we've got to change. I think Margaret Thatcher made really big inroads into this. She got rid of the sort of class system that the United Kingdom used to operate under. She brought meritocracy right to the fore, and we need to learn meritocracy again. We've got to understand that life isn't about equal outcomes. Life is about equal opportunity. We've got to give everyone the opportunity to succeed, whether they're white, brown, black, whatever. Give everyone the opportunity to succeed and allow them to fulfill their potential through that. And if they don't make it, well, not everyone's going to have the equal outcome. You can't have an equal outcome.
And finally, Ben, I want to ask you, of course, about Brexit, where we are. I mean, the end of the transition period now, fast approaching. How do you assess the government's performance, Boris Johnson's performance? How do you see things moving forward?
Well, Boris Johnson can't deliver his manifesto pledges on Brexit until he has put right the withdrawal agreement. And the most pernicious aspect of the withdrawal agreement is the Northern Irish Protocol, which basically signs Northern Ireland up to remaining in the EU. That's the simplest way to put it. And unless he's prepared to fix that, he can never really deliver what he promised the people in the election campaign last year. And leaving that aside, even though I think that's the biggest elephant in the room, leaving that aside, actually the negotiations of the future trade agreement that David Frost and Michael Barnier are trying to thrash out, I don't think is going well. The EU is sticking to its ideologically driven agenda of trying to subjugate the United Kingdom. David Frost is speaking out against it, but I see no tangible progress towards a deal. And I see no progress, and this is perhaps more important, Michael, I see no progress unilaterally in the United Kingdom towards preparing for no deal. Michael Gove, who has said repeatedly that no deal is not an option for the United Kingdom, is actually in charge of no deal planning, and he's taking no steps to prepare the country positively for that possible outcome. And unless Michael Gove and the United Kingdom prepare for a no deal outcome, we know we'll get a lousy deal. And my real fear, Michael, is that in order to hide the effects of the Northern Irish Protocol, actually we'll sign up to a deal that's really bad for the UK, that keeps us in the orbit of the European Union, so that no one can actually see the pernicious effects of the protocol. and that will not be Brexit. That remains my fear. And I've seen nothing. I mean, the rhetoric's great, but I've seen no tangible steps taken by the government to actually deliver on their manifesto promises.
Well, you can rest assured that whatever happens over the next few months, Westminster will be all over it. Ben Habib, look forward to having you back on the show soon, mate. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks, Michael.